So hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the Online Cenotaph. Just a couple housekeeping items. If everyone could remain on mute until the end of the presentation, that would be really helpful. At the end, we'll have some time for a Q&A, so please think of some questions you'd like Victoria to answer. Also, if you could all introduce yourselves in the chat, which some of you have already done that, who you are and where you're from, that would be great. So our speaker today is Victoria Passo. She is the collections manager for the Online Cenotaph at the Auckland War Memorial Museum and has been since 2014. Victoria obtained a Master's of Library and Information Studies from Victoria University of Wellington and holds an advisory role as one of the guardians kaitaki of the Alexander Turnbull Library. Victoria, whenever you're ready, we're all very excited to learn more about the Online Cenotaph.
Kia ora tātou, no ai rāni hoki o kutupuna, I whānau mai au I whangare, I tupu aki au I Tamaki Makaurau, kei au o ai raka ahau e noho ana, ko Victoria Passo tōku ingoa, kei Tamaki Pangihira ahau e mahi ana, he kai whakahaere Online Cenotaph me pau maumahara ahau. Ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei, ka mihi hoki au ki ngā tohu o te rohi nei, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Kia ora everybody, my name is Victoria. Thanks for the introduction. I can't see if you're writing messages or anything because I've made my screen just myself in the PowerPoint. So I'll just have to rely on other people to see if there's any questions. But today I'm speaking to you about Online Cenotaph, and it's quite an exciting year for us because Online Cenotaph was established 25 years ago in 1996 by Auckland War Memorial Museum, Tamaki Pangihira here in Auckland. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the context of Online Cenotaph, the history of the museum, just a little bit so you can get a bit of context, and then talk about what we are doing at the moment and how you guys can contribute or use Online Cenotaph, because I think sometimes people think it's just a military database, but actually it has lots of different functions and is a really great resource for genealogical research and even just researching people for if you're cataloguing collections and things like that. So this photo is of Auckland War Memorial Museum, and that opened in 1929. And the museum, Auckland Institute and Museum, has been going since 1852. So we're the oldest research institution in New Zealand. And in the First World War, the Auckland public started to think about whether we needed a war memorial. And so Auckland Council at the time and the public fundraised to create the Auckland War Memorial Museum, and the Hall of Memories is a space where people were able to come and commemorate the fallen families and of their brothers and sisters and children. And so the Hall of Memories held a lot of commemorative events, and so up until the 1990s, most of our commemoration at the museum was done physically. So on Anzac Day, Passchendaele, Armistice Day, like significant commemorative events. But it wasn't there was a war collection, so there's a human history collection of taonga that was kept by the museum, but there wasn't a specific war gallery for people to come and visit. And so these are just some photos of people commemorating or visiting during Anzac Day and the opening of the Auckland War Memorial, which I think is in November 1929. I could be making that up, which is likely. So in the early 90s, the museum started to redevelop its purpose, really, and to re-envisage how it was going to be a sort of like a modern museum. And so they redeveloped a huge number of galleries, and that included Pacific Lifeways, which is our Pacific galleries, and natural science galleries and things like that. And there was an act that was brought in 1996 that meant that we was in effect funded by Auckland Council. And so that sort of made us a little bit more of a public institution, as before we had been just like a pure trust, and it was a little bit of a just a different sort of organization. And so during that time, they started to think about making a gallery space for the wars, and they opened Scars 1 and Scars 2, New Zealand Scars on the Heart, for World War One and World War Two in late 1996. And as a sister project of this, the Cenotaph database was hatched, and it was, I believe, I could be wrong, it was sort of thought up by our long-standing human history curator, Rose Young, who was curator from the early 1990s until around 2016. And she had the idea of being able to commemorate New Zealanders who had died in service in a database so that it would sort of complement the World War One and World War Two galleries. And 1996 was quite an early time for databases in New Zealand. I mean, we've catalogued collections in the museum since the early 90s, but creating a database that didn't describe physical collections, I think, was probably quite a unique thing for within the New Zealand context. I mean, it was the same year that the Internet Archive was established, and I think, if you know about boring war things, the Commonwealth War Graves website didn't go up online until 1998. So the Cenotaph was established by a group of volunteers and staff in the research library, and they did an amazing job. They typed out the World War One deaths onto the website, as well as onto the database, as well as World War Two, and they continue to add content into there. So it wasn't a big, it was a very manual process. So this was all intranet based, and this is what, I love this screenshot. This is what it looked like. It's maybe in the early 2000s, maybe late 90s. It was still an intranet based thing. I know I'm nerding out on the history stuff, but I'm writing an article about it. So I just love some good pictures and some really big screens. Love it. And in the late 90s, we got a lot of funding and support from our returned and services associations. And so we still get a lot of support from our veterans who volunteer in the museum, as well as volunteering time to send us information. And so in the 90s, they sent out things not only in the RSA Review, which is a photo of Gabrielle Fortune, who was a volunteer for nearly 20 years in Cenotaph. And they sent that out in the review to ask everyone to contribute content to Online Cenotaph through that questionnaire. And people still send us answers to questionnaires in our form, but it just now happens to be online. And so the late 1990s was the time when a lot of our World War II veterans were beginning to get into their 70s and 80s. And so it was really seen as an important time for us to start gathering information about our vets. And then in the early 2000s, well, maybe not so early, maybe 2005, 2006, the Cenotaph database went online. And so the museum website went online maybe in the late 90s, but it was only like what's happening at the museum. And so now the website was online, and it meant that people could contact us for us to add information. And because it was via the web, it meant we got a lot of letters and emails from around the world. And the collection started to grow. So they extended the database to having the full nominal rolls, or full lists of all the Army service personnel from World War One. And then they started slowly trying to add World War Two, but it was just a lot of work. And so we had heaps of volunteers and staff, but it was, I think it was sort of like on the cusp between manual and digital. And so it sort of was an interesting time period for data management at the museum. And as you can see, they sort of did some snazzy database illustration and design and formatting, which is, again, I mean, I rather like it, but it's probably a bit dated now. So this is what the Cenotaph database was initially housed in. And it was in the armory, which basically means a space for guns and military sort of swords and all that sort of drama. And you can see on the left some of our volunteers and staff who were supporting us, and a few of those were veterans themselves. And so you could come into the gallery up until the early 2000s to search the database and then fill in forms to give to the staff. And later on, obviously, that went online. The Armory Information Centre was open for 20 years and was complementary to the World War II space. During that time, they got funding from the New Zealand Electronic Text Centre to digitise the World War One rolls of honour, and then they also did some other digitisation for like Auckland Weekly News images. I think we sort of overlapped with Auckland libraries during that time. And it was open 7 days a week and was really well utilised. It made sense during the 90s and early 2000s for a space for people to come in and be able to do research, because a lot of content wasn't yet online. And it was still very manual. When I turned up to Cenotaph in 2014, I had to work through, I think it was about 4 or 5 filing cabinets of paper content that hadn't yet got into the database. So it was sort of just, there was just floods of information. And I think that meant that we needed to sort of figure out a better way of doing things. And so during the World War 100, so that's the First World War commemoration period, the museum received funding from the Lotteries grant board to redo not only the database, but also to enable the refresh of the armory and the and other galleries on the memorial level. So in 2014, the website, basically there was a line in the sand made, and the database was transferred from DB TextWorks, which some of you might use in Magic, DB TextWorks, over to Vernon, which is the museum's main collection management system. And although there are other collections and other databases, and so that meant that we were able to sort of like leverage the information that was held by the human history collection in the war section and things like that to be able to sort of make our data a little bit more consistent. And it has also enabled us to create a functionality where people can add information directly into the website. So the Armory Information Centre was, oh, that was probably me, was staffed by staff, but also volunteers throughout the week. And then in 2015-16, the Paumo Mahara Memorial Discovery Centre opened. And again, it's a sister, sort of like the physical embodiment of Online Cenotaph. And the two smiling chaps on the left are Max and Roger, who are some of our volunteers. As I said, volunteers are really key to our success, and we really value the knowledge of our volunteers being able to not only sort of like provide an insight into some really niche areas, like Max is a big medal person, but also having veterans on site. Not all of our vols are veterans, but having veterans on site does mean that people are able to engage with veterans, which is not really a normal thing in New Zealand much anymore. So I know I'm talking about Paumo Mahara a lot, but it gives you context that it was designed for the First World War. And so each of the sort of islands, we call them islands in the gallery, are focusing on the First World War. And so the new Online Cenotaph was launched in 2015, and it was really the whole rebranding, the whole design, the whole vibe was focusing on the First World War. So I spent about 5 years just working on First World War content, and yeah, it became a bit of a slog, if I was to be honest. So the website was rebranded, redesigned, and it enabled us to create content. So we have stories on the homepage, and then also there's this little thing on the bottom of the homepage that says play your part, and it's a ticker box of all the things that have been added since 2015. So we've had 43,000 images contributed, nearly 100,000 pieces of data added to each of the sections on the individual pages, and 726,000 poppies laid. So that's a way that people can acknowledge the service personnel. So the lotteries and MCH really wanted to be able to meld the personal and official memory of New Zealand's service. And this has meant that before, in the olden times, the old Cenotaph database, where we would have to enrich the content one by one, with somebody sending a letter in or an email, we would update that record, which meant that we couldn't really develop the collection to be much bigger than as much as we could do. It's just so much content coming through that we just couldn't really keep up. And so now it means that people are able to add information into every section that we can then focus on developing the collection, and including Navy, Air Force, post-World War II conflicts as well. So this screenshot is just from the homepage at the moment. We've just published an article for Kukiairani Language Week about the mystery of Peter Utanga's guitar. We've interviewed Peter Gallagher, who was in the Malayan emergency, and he took 500 photos. Pretty amazing that we get to interview these people. And then Mari Watene, who is really well known for always saying the ode in Te Reo Māori, and at lots of Anzac events, and he's a poet and served in both Malaya and Vietnam. And then we also collaborate with people like Sarah Johnston, who's written about the recordings from Second World War, where people would send back recordings from the front to their families, and it would be played on the radio, which is pretty cool. So last year we published 49 things, because we not only write stuff ourselves, but we collaborate with lots of different people, and it's a really great way to be able to sort of understand New Zealand's service in a really individual way. Online Cenotaph doesn't focus on the entire war, as we let other outlets do that. So like New Zealand History does a really good job of creating articles that talk about J-Force or the Second World War, or specific campaigns or conflicts. We end up focusing just on an individual personnel, so that you get a more personal experience of what service was like for people. So I thought I would show you a record-ish. It's hard on a PowerPoint, but this is my great-grandfather, Henry Bill, and he lived on Waiheke Island, and joined the First World War with his brother, who lied and said he was his twin. I think he was too young to go overseas. And so in each section, where, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in each section where it says contribute, you can click and add content. And so in some of it, anywhere it says like public/Victoria, that's where a member of the public has added information. And then you might also see little bits that say AWMM, and that means that Auckland Museum has added that information. So this content from the public, contributed from the public, and the content that is held in Vernon, which is our collection management system, it's held in 2 separate places. And so you're not, so people go, oh, I want to edit this record. You can't. That's my team, Dan and Madison and myself will update the records, but the public can't. So it's not like Wikipedia, because we sort of need to verify if somebody has actually been on active service and not just popping names up without verification. But all of the content that is added, it was early decision made when we relaunched the website, was that all the content would be published without verification or a validation step. And that is not, well, really that's because there's only 3 or 4 of us doing that work, and it would just be too much work for us to verify. And the point of it is people to share their information and their sources. We do remove content if it's inaccurate, if somebody asks us to. Heaps of people put up like the wrong portrait, or they accidentally say that this person died in the wrong year, and so we're easily able to amend that for people. But we generally just publish this content online. It's put up under a CC BY license, and that's aligned with the museum's approach to opening up our collections. But obviously the images and other content that is provided will still be covered under different copyright restrictions, but the data itself is shared freely and openly through our API. And so lots of, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is lots of our partners are able to use our content without much hassle. So we have 247,000 records. I think when it first went online, like on the internet, there was about 35,000 records, and that was for people who had died in the First and Second World War. And now it includes South Africa, so that's the late 19th century, early 20th century, First World War, J-Force, so that's 1946 to 48 in the British Commonwealth Occupation Force of Japan. I have to remember that. Korea with the army, Malayan emergency, Borneo, Vietnam. And then we sort of, if we're honest, we sort of don't focus on the most recent conflicts. One, because the resources aren't freely available, and they're under privacy, you know, we couldn't get access to them. But if people want to, they can contribute information about their own service. It's a choice that they can choose to share that information with us. So the other thing that we've had recently created is popular searches. Because there's so many records of people, it's sometimes difficult to sort of get deeper into the content. And so we will create things that are able to sort of highlight the lesser known stories. And so that includes like some of people of different heritage. So we'll have Chinese service personnel, Cook Islands, Rarotongan service personnel, and then voluntary aid detachments. So a lot of the women service personnel who get a little bit lost in the content because there's fewer, you can count them, there are less of them. And so we've been able to create popular searches from that. So it means you can click into the link and then see a list of all the people that relate to that specific topic. And we've actually found that to be really helpful to be able to package up information. But also we're able to then, because you can see down the side all the different ones we've got at the moment, we're able to highlight research from specific contributors. So we work with lots of people who are doing some amazing private research or personal research, and they share that content with us. So like the 41st Squadron is the ground crew that served in Vietnam who hadn't received as much acknowledgement as other service personnel. And we work with Scotty Douglas on getting that content online. And so that is this is a really great place for us to be able to highlight that stuff. And if you're working in a specific special collection or a collection that might link to us, you know, like we've got a short list for finding New Zealand artists. which is the database of New Zealand artists. We've linked to that as much as we can, but a lot of the times it's sort of hard to figure out unless you know who the artist is. But if you've got a collection, we'd be more than happy to make a popular search if we can link back to our Cenotaph records. So here are some examples of notes that have been left. Online Cenotaph is a funny thing to sort of work on, because it I think, like lots of collections actually, really is all around emotion, empathy, and openness. And so, you know, while I might be really good at looking after a database, if I'm not good at nurturing relationships, I think that makes it that would make it quite a lot more challenging. And so the content that is on Cenotaph can be quite impactful. And so, you know, I'm conscious of supporting, our team is conscious of supporting each other when we have things that can be a little bit more impactful. So things like you never spoke about the war, and now I can acknowledge you on Cenotaph. I think that sort of is a really constant theme that has come through Online Cenotaph. And I am working with Chun Lee from Victoria University, and she's completing a project that focuses on the social impact of Online Cenotaph. So it'll be really interesting to see why people contribute and why people continue to come back year after year to acknowledge their tupuna. But also we have people who contribute thousands of things, sometimes every week, or at least hundreds of things. And just to see that there are some people who just really want to acknowledge people who have served, and we're really lucky that the website is able to sort of enable those connections to be made. So these are some of the images of how many did I say? Over 30,000 images that have been added to Cenotaph. And again, enabling people to add content is choice, because it takes a lot of time for us to add an image to Online Cenotaph from our side of things. So like every research collection, we have to save it in multiple places with a raw file and a TIFF, and then a JPEG, and a blah blah blah, and describe it and all that sort of jazz. And so people being able to add content directly into the record has meant that we've been able to, as I said, focus on being able to enrich and expand the collection. And also, people sometimes send us very tiny images, and they will, in the past, we'd have to say no to adding images, because if you're sending us a 12 kilobyte image, which is literally the size of a postage stamp, it's really difficult for us to have that in our collection, because it's not really particularly useful for us. But then because we've got people adding content directly into the records, we don't have to always have those conversations, which makes it a little bit easier, because it was quite hard. And most of I'll be honest, there are 12 kilobyte files in the Cenotaph collection. It is what it is. So also people assume that people, when they left for service, would have their photo taken, and they didn't. I think maybe Australia did that, but we didn't. And so this sharing of that sort of special knowledge and collections means that some people are able to see their family members for the first time, and that has a real impact. And I think sometimes I forget how impactful that is for people. And yeah, it's a really cool thing to be able to sort of scroll through and see what people have contributed. And this year, after me working on this for a little bit, we've started to put our statistics up on the website. So there is a page that says how many people are using it and how many people use it. Did I just say that twice? Life. So most of our contributors are from New Zealand, but we do have a range of users from around the world, including Poland, Switzerland, France. It's interesting. And And I put this up because I just sort of think, I'm not sure that so many other GLAM people will put content up like this, but I think it is quite interesting, especially working on a project that works with and relies on and collaborates with the public, so that people can actually see the impact that they're having on the website. Yeah, I think it's just a useful tool for people to be able to see what we are doing, and it's not that the website is alive and not just a static page. So just going back to the Cenotaph Stories, we really enjoy being able to talk to our veterans and their whānau. And we've also sort of diversified the stories that we've been telling a little bit, and we were lucky to receive some funding from Copyright Licensing New Zealand, who supported 5 articles to be written or created by up-and-coming New Zealand writers or creators. And so you can see a video by Jodie Jackson Becerra, who was talking about the impact on COVID and sort of like that commemoration of that event. And we also have visited the RSA down at Parnell, and that just links to the Uncle Bambi Peter Utanga story. And we're really lucky to be able to work with our great photographers at the museum, who are able to capture some really beautiful photos of our veterans. And it's just, I think it's just lovely to be able to sort of see them now. So both Murray and Peter are in their 80s, and then you see photos of them when they were in service. And so it's just a really interesting thing to see, as you sort of think, oh, that's you know, you might walk past somebody in the street and you don't know what their life experiences have been like. Did you think that they were reading a newspaper in the Malayan jungle? Probably not, in the 1960s. And so I think the other thing that has been really eye-opening for myself and Madison, who I've done a few interviews with Madison, who's in my team, is that a lot of the collections that our veterans hold from post-World War II are not held in public collections. Mainly that's around copyright, but that's also because the veterans have kept the collections in their personal, in their homes and in their families. And so we've been able to sort of get access to content that is not actually very well known about or seen. And so a lot of our relationship on Online Cenotaph is creating those relationships for our other collections in the museum, to sort of be able to see whether at some point those collections would be able to come into the museum. And that's been a real pleasure to be able to build and foster those relationships. So going to what we're really focusing on at the moment, is, I think I've covered a little bit, is we're focusing on post-World War II. And Dan, who is in that little vignette, says AM South, who's in my team. So I have Madison and Dan. Dan has moved to Wellington and was in the archives in Archives New Zealand, as well as working in the National Library reading room, and he has taken thousands and thousands of photos on his phone in Archives New Zealand. And we have a group of transcribers working their way through the content. I counted it up a couple of months ago, and I think we had 27,000 pages, and I think we'd only transcribed about 3,500. So we've got a bit of a way to go. So this content is held in Archives New Zealand. It's openly accessible, and that's just an example of a transcriber. We just use Google Sheets, pretty straightforward, pretty simple, and sounds terrible, but we really made hay during the COVID lockdowns. So we had our about 14 visitor hosts and maybe 8 volunteers transcribing content for us. And that has that created a momentum to enable us to transcribe the content for Online Cenotaph. And this has then created a project where we are now collaborating with Archives New Zealand, and they're digitizing content for us, and then we're going to transcribe and return to them. So that's really exciting to be able to get new records that actually are not in any other source online. And so we're sort of creating, in effect, new knowledge, which, you know, it's great to be able to acknowledge our service personnel, but also increase our understanding or just of content that is held in other collections, which is really cool. So Online Cenotaph, I think I said before, we're a pretty open collection. We absolutely respect the wishes of our personnel. So if somebody asks us to remove content, we will, but most of the time the content is made freely available on the interwebs. And so we've collaborated with people like A Street Near You, which has all the people maps of where people, all of the service personnel who died during the First World War and where they died. You can sort of follow their journey a little bit. We've just launched on Digital Pacific, which is really cool to get Pacific personnel on that platform. We're on Digital New Zealand, and we gave content and data to Measuring the Anzacs, which is a transcription project that is transcribing all of the World War One military files and the lives of the First World War, which is the Imperial War Museum project. I don't know what's the next one. Oh, it's the end of that. So yeah, I've talked for 40 minutes and I apologize. That sort of cenotaph, I hope I've covered stuff, and I'd be absolutely more than happy for questions to be asked. Yeah. Oh, I should probably say, people think, as I said before, people think that cenotaph is just for military people, but we have had researchers use the database for lots of different purposes. So because it's a big chunk of information, with like the Waitiata Press with Sydney Shep has utilized it to support a land claim, land court research. We've had a researcher at the King's College London use it for voting, sort of like voting analysis in the Second World War. And so it's not just for war, you can use it for lots of different ways to reconnect to your whakapapa as well. And yeah, and I'd love to be able to collaborate if there are people who have ideas on how they can sort of raise their collections up, because we do get a solid monthly viewership. So happy to discuss that. Kia ora.
So if anybody has any questions, they can just unmute and ask them. You don't have to type them anywhere. I have one question, which I can just get us started. What is one of the most unique or interesting entries you've come across?
Oh, I don't know how to turn. Is my screen turned off, or are you now seeing my terrible screen?
No, we're now seeing your screen.
I knew it. Do you want to see my dog? Hold on. Oh no, you're good. Oh, thank you. Thank you for doing that.
There you go.
Good question. I think, what is the most interesting? I don't know. There's 247,000. I can't tell you one that I think is interesting. I think what I've learned, I mean, this is such a political answer. What I've learned is that, you know, like when we first started, we were sort of focusing on the big wigs, you know, the people who were really well known, established politicians, or people who were like sportsmen and all that sort of jazz. And actually the most interesting ones are sort of learning about the lesser, just the normal everyday people and sharing their stories is actually much more like interesting, and raising those stories up, like, you know, Peter Utanga's guitar, where he took it around the Pacific and people signed his guitar case, you know, 200 people. He's from Rarotonga, and he kept that all his life and then gifted it to the RSA in Parnell. And he didn't have a particularly flashy life. He loved going to the rugby league. He loved a beer, a rum and coke, and that was his life. But that legacy that had impacted, you know, people who remembered him playing the guitar during the Second World War. I think those are the interesting stories, not necessarily like the colonels and I mean, no disrespect to the majors and all the big guys. I think, and also focusing on non-Pākehā men, I think is also, those are the stories that I'm most interested in. That's a good answer.
We had a question from Dan. Wanted to know if you missed the dog cameo. But you
Dan
didn't.
is my staff member, I believe.
From Auckland Library.
Oh.
Anyway, his question was, is there anything other glamour institutions can do to support your mahi?
Probably, I don't know. I think we've done it a lot. We're doing a lot. We've collaborated with organizations like Auckland Libraries, where they've had this beautiful Schmidt collection of portraits from World War One. It would be really cool to be able to get more recent conflict photos, but I know that copyright is an issue. But also just maybe highlighting or alerting us to resources that we just may not know about, because I think Dan has, I think, taken photos, and we've digitized-ish about 160 folders from Archives New Zealand. So we have a lot of content that we're working through, but we always like to be able to, you know, share more content from other collections, because our collection, we're not precious like that. We're not describing a physical collection. The collection is sharing data and is connecting all those different resources.
Cool. Does anybody else have any other questions? Is the online Cenotaph available for overseas people to entry stuff into, seeing as people travel a lot and stuff like that? Like, have you ever had anyone overseas?
Yeah, so I should have probably said that at the beginning. Online Cenotaph is just for New Zealand personnel or New Zealanders who have served overseas. So it's people who have served in the Australia and World War One. They're included. But a lot of our contributors, even though we're like a regional, we're not a regional museum, but we're like a city museum in Auckland. We're not funded by the government. It's a national and internationally used resource. And so a lot of our contributors are from overseas, and people that, you know, heaps of people moved to Australia. And so lots of our veterans who contribute death notices and information are not in New Zealand. And so, yes, people are contributing from everywhere.
Cool. A question from Debbie. From a patron's perspective, if they find a relative in your database, how do they then proceed to find further information on their military history? So
if they are from the First World War, it's likely that their file has been digitized and is available from Archives New Zealand. And we 95% of the time would have linked to that at the bottom of the record. And then there's a sources section at the bottom of Cenotaph where we will have added and enriched over time. So for example, in the last couple of years, we've done a lot of work on prisoners of war. And so we'll have gone through lists, transcribed them, and then put that information up. And also, if you are wanting more support and there's not enough information on the website, you can always contact us through the contact us page on Auckland Museum. And we receive probably on average about 180 inquiries a month from all around the world, asking us about their relatives or about people that they're researching. Sorry if you can hear my dog in the background.
That's okay.
Dogs.
Does anybody else have any questions? Can give it like a minute, and then if not, then we're done. It was very interesting. I didn't know a lot about the Online Cenotaph before hearing this. So I've learned something.
Yeah. Hi, Alison. I should have said that over the years we have added content from and worked with lots of different providers in the sector, digitizing content, transcribing content, and that's the challenge I think for us, is that people expect, I think they assume that we're the Defence Force and that we have access to the Defence Force content. And so we aren't. We have really great relationships with the Defence Force archives in Trentham and are providing the content that we've transcribed to them. And so we support each other in the inquiry process. And so if there are questions we can't ask, we always have somewhere we can direct people to. So it's not just, we not only create data, but we also answer inquiries, and that's a core part of our work. And we love answering questions. That's just fun.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have. So thank you so much for joining us today, everyone, and you as well, Victoria. And I hope everyone can have a chance to visit the Online Cenotaph.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.